Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to another CBT Nuggets webinar from trainer Simona Millham. Today, she'll be walking us through some of the biggest pitfalls of new Agile adopters. She's a certified Agile Scrum Master and recently released a course about Agile Essentials. Simona will answer your questions at the end, but you can send your questions throughout the webinar using the chat window. We'll be posting a recording of this webinar to our blog later this week at cbtnuggets.com/blog, and we'll also send it to you via email. So get ready for all the great information coming your way. Take it away, Simona.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you all for joining me on this webinar today. We've got about a 30-minute time slot this evening. Well, it's evening here in the UK, but I realise it might not be wherever you are in the world. Anyway, I've got about 15 minutes worth of content to share with you so as to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So, what are the big 5 pitfalls to avoid falling into if you are new to the world of Agile? Now, obviously, we will go through them, but in summary, firstly here, not getting senior level buy-in to Agile. Number 2, not staying true to the Agile Manifesto and the 12 Agile Principles. And number 3 here, not enough education around Agile. Number 4, not having the right roles in place. And finally, expecting too much too soon from your Agile implementation. And what better place to start than with number 1 on my list here, not getting senior level buy-in. So whatever books or articles you read, I think you'll find that experts unanimously agree that an Agile transformation is only likely to succeed if it is heavily supported, not just at the beginning, but on an ongoing basis by the management. So therefore, we can deduce that limited executive sponsorship will equal limited agility. There really is no two ways about it. Now, when I say that we need executive sponsorship, it's not just a case that we need them to kind of rock up to our kickoff meeting and pay a bit of lip service. I mean that they have got to have properly embraced the changes that will be necessary. Because Agile really gets deep into the culture, the values and the principles of an organisation. So it's not just all about reshuffling a few teams and buying a new tool. No, Agile is meant to be disruptive. And I know it's an overused analogy, but it really is just like an iceberg, with the visible changes up here being the obvious things that we see first. But we need to be able to get to, and probably change, these deep-seated culture and values and principles in an organisation. And we can't do that if senior management don't let us empower the right people to enable an Agile transformation to happen. And you know the sort of attitude I mean. So look at these 2 Agile principles here. For example, if we were to explain to senior management that our development teams self-organise and we just trust them to get the job done, and they might say, well, no, we can't do that here, but let's say we will try this Agile thing out, but we're going to carry on micromanaging our developers like we always have done in the past. Well, clearly this character here has missed the point entirely. So in this example, there isn't a culture of trust in the organisation. And that's not something that can be changed easily without commitment from senior management. And it's really demotivating for individuals because the feeling of empowerment that Agile brings is one of the most widely reported benefits that we see being enjoyed by team members. And I know that was certainly one of the first things that was said here at CBT Nuggets when we first implemented Scrum. So if that empowerment isn't genuinely enabled, then the Agile initiative is very likely to just fade away, and quite possibly some of your most innovative employees might leave in frustration. So without executive sponsorship, it will be an uphill struggle. You're really going to be swimming against the tide. Now, having said all that, I do appreciate that senior executives might need some evidence to help them understand whether Agile would be a good fit for their organisation. So you might consider just trying it for just a small part of your organisation, if that's possible. You know, do some short sprints, get some feedback and get some empirical data together to help your cause. Anyway, I think I've made my point, so let me speed on to pitfall number 2 here, which is not staying true to Agile principles. Now, I already gave an example of this whereby a senior executive might say, oh, yeah, we'll go Agile, but we can't let our teams self-organise. But we can fall into the same trap with our team members too. For example, look at this other Agile principle here. There are actually 12 principles in total, by the way, which I do cover in my Agile Essentials course. But anyway, this one says that we should deliver working software frequently, every couple of weeks or so. The point being that with Agile, we're not using a traditional waterfall approach where we start off by producing the product specification that's really well defined and very detailed, and that gets then passed on to the architecture team and the design team, and finally we can start coding, and then we can do some testing, and then finally, some months later, we can deploy it out to users and get feedback from the actual people who'll be using the product. So no, we don't do this with Agile. The Agile Principles tell us that we deliver working software every couple of weeks. So instead of those great big sequential phases that we had with Waterfall, we have these short cycles or sprints of just a couple of weeks long, and the idea is that we produce a working iteration of our product after every sprint. Now, because each cycle is so short and we're getting user feedback so fast, we're learning what works and what doesn't as we go along, rather than having to anticipate it all up front like we did with the traditional plan-based approach. So we're inspecting and we're adapting with each iteration. And because these cycles are so short, we can, if we need to, change direction very easily. That's the whole point of Agile. But look, can you see that within each sprint, we're doing all of the analysis, the design, the coding and testing required to complete the individual features that will be able to be released as a working product increment. And so, to get back to my pitfall, you've got to make sure that each sprint doesn't turn into a mini waterfall where we do all of the analysis and the design up front, and then we code everything, and finally we test it all. Because what happens if we get to the end of the sprint here? We haven't got working software which we could ship to our users, and that's the Agile Principle. So instead, we work on individual features one at a time, and we integrate testing throughout all of the development work to be sure we've always got a working product increment to deliver every couple of weeks or so. And while we're on the subject of staying true to the Agile Principles, look at this statement here from the Agile Manifesto, which says that we value working software over comprehensive documentation. Now that sounds sensible enough to me. Which is the customer going to prefer? Software that actually works, or a big wad of paperwork explaining how it's going to work? But before we crack open the champagne because we hate writing documentation, you've got to be really careful here. The manifesto says that yes, working software is more important than documentation because working software is our primary measure of progress, but it doesn't mean we can ignore the documentation altogether. But what about the scenario where the team delights in not putting the priority on creating documentation? So yeah, that gets a big thumbs up. But what happens if they don't actually manage to create a working product increment at the end of the sprint either? You really can't cherry pick which bits of Agile that you like and skimp on the rest. That's really not going to work. Now, I am keeping an eye on the questions panel in the webinar console, and I can see a couple of questions have already come in. Thank you very much. That's great. But please do continue to type in your questions whenever you think of them, and I'll answer them at the end of our webinar. Anyway, this pitfall of not staying true to Agile Principles is very closely aligned with my next pitfall, which is not doing enough educating around Agile. So ask yourself, have the sponsors, the upper management and your customers been educated on the process that you're using? Because if not, their expectations and where they put their efforts is going to be more closely aligned to traditional approaches, more traditional waterfall plan-based methodologies. Because, without enough education, they don't know enough about how they can support the Agile teams, and therefore they'll continue with their business as usual approach, so the waterfall mindset lives on. And if the command and control approach is all they've ever known, then that's what they'll fall back on in the absence of knowing what else to do. And there is much to learn about Agile. For example, it isn't the end of the world if we have a failed sprint, because Agile teaches us to learn from our mistakes and move on. It's all part of the inspect and adapt cycle of iterative and incremental development. But there are all sorts of other details that could trip us up, and you can see some examples here. For example, a senior manager might want to compare the output from different teams, but we can't compare velocity unless we're really confident that they are estimating the size of the development tasks in the same way. And look at this one. With Agile, we don't create these enormous 18-month project plans because why waste time on creating a comprehensive plan at the beginning of the project, which is exactly when we know the least about it? And quite often people think of Agile as equating to fast, whereas actually the competitive advantage that we gain with Agile is being able to respond to change rather than just working at flat-out breakneck speed all of the time. And we also need to factor in time to keep our code clean and tidy and to perform any platform upgrades as required in order to avoid technical debt. But you can imagine that any one of these things would confuse a stakeholder or a manager, so a little bit of education about the mechanics of Agile can go a really long way in assisting with the success of your Agile transformation. Okay, I am mindful of the time, so let's crack on with pitfall number 4, which is not having the right roles in place. We already know that our development team should be self-organising, but they should also be completely self-sufficient, almost like a little miniature business startup. So they have all of the skills required between them to get the job done, so to produce that working product increment. They should also be a small team. So Agile learnings tell us that a team of more than, say, about 12 or so people doesn't self-organise that well. And ideally, they should be co-located. But I think that most importantly is the casting of the role of the product owner. Now, they should be empowered to be able to make the final decision, and they should be of a type of personality that they are happy to make quick and difficult decisions. If one of the goals of Agile is being able to react efficiently to change, then decision by committee or having to escalate things up the hierarchy, which always takes ages, is absolutely not in the spirit of Agile. So the product owner should always be available to answer questions and make decisions, preferably every day. And also we're expecting them to be able to interact with the development team on a regular basis. We've got another Agile principle which tells us that the business people and the developers should collaborate together every day. And then an Agile coach or a Scrum Master can be invaluable to help with some of our previous pitfalls. So they can help with senior management buy-in and adhering to Agile principles and educating around Agile as well. So if we get this wrong, if our product owner decides to micromanage the project, then she breaks the self-organising element of our development team. Or perhaps she decides to act as both product owner and the Agile coach, which can lead to a conflict of interest. So it's really important to understand these roles and apply them properly. And finally, pitfall number 5 here is not to expect too much too soon, because Agile is a journey. You've got to play it by the book as closely as you can to start with, and then when you really understand Agile and you've identified what works for you and what doesn't, that's when you can start to create your own version of Agile. There are some different frameworks to choose from. For example, you might have heard of Scrum or Kanban, and the reality is that many organisations will take a unique mixture of these for their particular environment. But you're not going to create an award-winning Agile team overnight. But as long as you do keep on moving forward, you keep on making improvements, then you are winning. And certainly if you're planning on scaling Agile to cover multiple teams across large projects, then you need to make sure that you do just scale the bits that work. So start small with just a couple of teams and perfect your processes before you scale it out across the organisation. And I always think that scaling Agile is rather like setting up a franchise. So you start small, perfect it, and then when you've got a formula that works, that's when you replicate it. So there we go, the 5 big pitfalls that you can avoid falling into with Agile.